and welcome to this, again?
Yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this CEU alumni webinar. Our subject today is looking at the sharing economy, and the question I'd like to ask is, what is new about the sharing economy? We have about 1 hour today, and the plan is that I will speak for about 25 to 30 minutes, and then we'll have the rest of the time for questions and answers, because I'm sure there'll be lots of questions and answers about this particular topic. Now, the way it's going to work is that you'll see on your interface that there's a chat icon. If you click on that, you can then type in your questions. We're not going to have a two-way audio, but rather we'll take it with questions in that form, and your questions will be taken in the order in which they come. We've already had 3 questions already, so once the Q&A session begins, we'll start with those, and then we'll move straight into the questions that you're going to ask during this session. So why don't we get started? I'll tell you what I'm not going to talk about this afternoon. I'm not going to talk about intelligent machines. This is a very important area, and it's obviously clearly related to the emergence of sharing economy, but I won't talk about how intelligent machines are effectively changing the way in which economic exchange occurs. We'll leave that out. I think a second topic that I won't talk about is the surveillance society and the sharing economy, because clearly, one of the huge public policy implications of economic sharing is that essentially privacy is more or less over, because we're always sharing information, and that information, of course, can be used both for good and bad reasons, both in the public sector and the state. And I also won't talk about plans for sharing apps. I'm happy to talk with you about those one-on-one, but I won't get into those today. So why don't we get started? I think the first thing when we think about the sharing economy, we have to understand the changing context in which sharing is occurring. And just bear with me for a couple of minutes here, because what I want to do is I want to talk about kind of historical evolutions. If you think about it, the sharing economy is more or less a feature that has occurred in, let's say, the last decade, right? So we begin to see sharing as a serious activity within the last 10 years. But if we go back in time, we can actually see that sharing is part of a much broader evolution of industrial organization, going all the way back to the very first days of capitalism, right? So if we think about it for a minute here, many people are now referring to the current phase of capitalism that we're in as called late capitalism. That phrase was first kind of coined by German sociologists like Jürgen Habermas and these guys, right? And essentially what that means is that we have achieved a very high level of sophistication in terms of technology, a broad diffusion of capital, and unfortunately, I think, one of the outcomes of late capitalism is increasing income inequality, which is something I come back to when we think about why sharing occurs. And so if we work our way backwards, at the turn of the millennium, a very important thing occurred, which is the emergence of ecosystems and networks, right? So companies were going away from being vertically integrated companies into being these kind of rather complex networks of firms. And then you can go back to vertical integration, which was more or less kind of driven by mass production. So you can think of Fordism and central planning in socialist economies. And before that, of course, you can go back to the Industrial Revolution, in which we essentially went from being an economy of small artisanal production to an economy of integrated large-scale production, right? So in that sense, the sharing economy is, I think, an evolutionary phase, and it's the latest phase of industrial organization. Now, what does that mean? It means that we're seeing new activities which we haven't seen before. You'll see on my slide here, I've got a series of activities here. So, for example, neo-artisans, right? So this idea that essentially we're moving back to an economy where people are producing and consuming simultaneously. Right? This is what we call C2C markets, rather than the traditional B2B or B2C, right? So we've got these new kinds of economic exchange. Probably a number of you are familiar with Etsy, right, which is the world's biggest online marketplace, right, where you get individuals making handmade artisanal products and selling them online. Etsy is not just about transactions, it's also about sharing of artisanal knowledge, which is something I'll come back to. I'm sure a number of you have heard of the Internet of Things, which is this very complex set of internets. If you want to know more about the Internet of Things, I recommend you read anything by Jeremy Rifkin. Jeremy Rifkin has written extensively on the Internet of Things. In his last book, The Collaborative Economy, he spends a fair amount of time looking at that. I mean, to keep it simple, within a minute, it's basically a series of shared information processes. So you've got the traditional internet that we use every day for email and so forth, but we've also got new forms of internet. We've got the energy internet, where we're trading energy online. We've got the logistics internet now, so real-time tracking of goods and services, and so on. So that's that. And the key thing with the Internet of Things, which I think makes the sharing economy so valuable, is because we're creating data. So we create digital footprints with everything that we do. And so for some companies, that's become a particular way in which we make money. I'm sure you all heard of freelancing, right? Which is this increased tendency for people not to take traditional careers, contract-based careers, working through large organizations, but choosing, in some cases, and in others being forced to adopt careers which are much more flexible. Of course, Uber is the archetypal example of the freelancing economy, right, where individuals use their cars, which are relatively underused assets at most times, and they use those to generate income. Then we've got new bartering, which I think is present today, but I think is likely to become more important as the sharing economy grows. New bartering is essentially this idea that we, instead of trading goods and services for money, we trade goods and services for each other. Right? So if I make something and you make something, instead of using money to manage our transaction, we actually share goods with each other, which of course, anyone who's done an economics degree will kind of be immediately suspicious, because one of the reasons why money was introduced in the first place was that it was a form of way of having a common means of expressing value. We've got peer lending now, increasingly, so people are moving away from traditional banks to lend money, to borrow money from, now what they're doing increasingly is they're lending money to each other, which is a very disruptive event for the financial and services industry, which I'll come back to later on when I talk about scenarios. We've got additive manufacturing, which is basically 3D printing. Personally, I'm quite fascinated by 3D printing. I think the idea that 20 years from now, everybody will have their own 3D printer at home and will be printing objects rather than going to a shop has such far-reaching consequences for so many industries. It's incredible. I was recently talking to a bunch of people in China who work for Inditex Group, which is the Zara, Massimo Dutti, these guys, and I was suggesting to them that, with the emergence of 3D printers who can print clothes, I actually have some backup slides. I can show you some images of what 3D printed objects look like. You can actually start printing your own clothes. What that means for retailing is extraordinary. And then the last thing, which I think is closely related to sharing, is the closed loop economy. So instead of importing our pineapples from Hawaii for breakfast here in Budapest, or in the many other places on the list of people that have come in for the webinar, we're actually going to start sourcing more and more of what we eat, wear, use locally. And so if you look at all of this changing context, we are witnessing an extraordinary change in the nature of the economy, and this has massive implications for the creation of value and how we share that value. Right? So let's just drill down a little bit further here and sort of look at what are the vectors that are driving the sharing economy. I've mentioned some already, but I haven't mentioned one there. You'll see demographic and societal factors, and this is the emergence of Generation Y and Z, the so-called millennials. One of the things we're seeing about millennials is that they are a fundamentally different set of people from previous generations. And I'll kind of highlight 2 or 3 factors which I think are very important for understanding the emergence of the sharing economy. The first is that the millennials are not interested in ownership as much as previous generations. So what they're really interested in is in access, right? So they don't want to necessarily own a car, but they want to get from A to B in a car, right? So Uber is really interesting because it means you don't have to own a car, but you can get quickly from A to B. Companies like Car2Go, who also lease out electric cars for half an hour, 1 hour, and so forth. You think about streaming music, Spotify, and so forth. These are all sort of things that millennials are really interested in. That's the first thing I think about millennials, which is worth noting. I think the second is millennials are not loyal in the same way that other generations were, right? So millennials are not that interested in working for one company for the whole of their lives. What they're looking for are experiences. And if they can get experiences from other organizations, they'll have little or no problem with turning their back on the current organization they're working for. And I think this is also driving a lot more freelancing, is that people don't necessarily feel that organizations give them loyalty, so why should they give loyalty to them? And I think the last thing is that the millennials are completely online communities. So if you look at the amount of digitized activity that millennials undertake, it's magnitudes higher than previous generations. And I think that's really important, particularly for digitized sharing. And this sense of community, which I think many previous generations focused on, this idea that essentially communities are local people, I think are being replaced by these very complex global networks of people that stay in touch through social media and so forth. I think the final thing I want to emphasize on this slide before we move on is the issue of environmental stewardship. I think millennials have, for obvious reasons, because they're the ones that are going to survive after people like me die, they're very worried about the nature of the environment, and they're very concerned about the impact of consumerism on non-renewable resources. And I think that part of the sharing economy is this idea is that we shouldn't underutilize resources. So we should only have resources that we need, and those resources should be just good enough, which, maybe we can come to this in the discussion as well, if you're a company, if you're Samsung Electronics, or if you're a white goods manufacturer like Gorenier or Zanussi, and you make washing machines and refrigerators that deliberately break down after 3 years, so you go out and buy a new one, this whole concept of underutilized resources and sharing fundamentally threatens your entire business model, right? So you have to go back to making products that last a long time that can be shared, and I think that's a really significant threat to traditional ways of making money. So basically, in summary, what we're moving from, right, is we're moving from a vertically distributed economy, right, where you have integrated firms managing supply chains, to an entirely new world of what I call laterally scaled, so horizontal relationships, peer-to-peer, networked, and collaborative prosumption. So a fundamental transformation in the way in which we create value. And we can talk about this when we look at scenarios. And as I mentioned before, the Internet of Things is the backdrop for so much of this. This is Mark Zuckerberg. I'm sure many of you know. I know that most of you give away your personal data every day to one of his organizations. But aside from making huge amounts of money from Facebook, and well done to him, he's also got this organization called internet.org here, which is an organization which is supposedly going to create free internet for the world. Now it's come under a lot of criticism because it's targeting developing countries, because obviously Mark Zuckerberg works out, in India, where you have a growing population, there's going to be lots of people giving away their data so that you can collect that data and sell it. But if we just take a look at this idea that essentially the internet would be free at the point of use, this is going to transform pretty much everything we do in economic terms. So here are just some numbers which I pulled off in my Google search. And just, 50 trillion gigabytes of data by 2020. I think that's a complete underestimate, unless we have some kind of, Earth crisis. 25 plus million apps, 4 billion connected people. Again, I think we're underestimating that number. If you look at the emergence of affordable internet in developing countries, I think that number could be much higher. And I guess for those of us interested in making money, here we go. $4 trillion potential revenue from Internet of Things activities related to sharing. So this is a significant business opportunity in addition to being a fundamental restructuring of society. Now here's a very simple kind of 2x2 model that's been developed by some folks in France who've tried to sort of think about what are the different kinds of sharing economy. So why don't I just go through each of these in turn so we can understand. Let's start up here in the top left-hand corner, we've got the altruists, right? So this is where sharing is done because it's the right thing to do. Right? So this is where you give away your expertise or your underutilized resources for free. Okay, so for example, right now in Paris, there's a movement where people will share each other's washing machines, right? And they do it for free. They're not getting any money from it, but from a sense of community, why don't we have one washing machine for a floor rather than everyone having their own washing machines? And this is sometimes called free revealing. Eric von Hippel at MIT developed this concept when he looked at sort of open innovation. And essentially what we're doing here is we recognize that by cooperating for free, we get better functionality from the assets that we own, which is a kind of interesting idea because generally speaking, economics and business would argue that you buy things because you see a monetary value from doing so, right? But actually, I think increasingly people are saying, well, money's not everything. Maybe we can actually live a society where community and sharing is more important than getting rich, per se. If we move down here to the bottom left, we've got the so-called owners idea. And this is where essentially what somebody does is they own an asset, which is quite useful, and people pay to use or access it. So, for example, in parts of East Africa, there was this quite interesting practice of someone in the village buying a SIM card for their mobile phone and letting people use their mobile phone to ring to the city to get someone to call back. So essentially what they're using the ringtone as semaphore, right? So someone would buy a SIM card, fill up, put it in there, pay as you go phone, and people would pay small amounts of money to let the phone ring twice so that their brother or sister or uncle or whatever in the city would know it's them and they call them back for free. Now put yourself in the shoes of a mobile phone company who makes money from use. It kills your business model, right? But this person can actually make a living and get a return on their investment in their SIM card. Really fascinating kind of sharing practice. Then we've got the so-called collectivists. And this is where somebody or a group of individuals have a project. The best example of this would be Linux. Right? Linux kind of kicks this off, right? Where you kind of have crowdsourcing and people program together. And they kind of do it not because they're making money, but because they're computer people and they like to solve problems. Right? So they're programmers that go, hang on a minute, I've got a really cool fix for this particular problem you have with this line of code. And then today, of course, we've got Wikipedia, which is a sort of an iconic form of collectivist sharing. And then the last one we have are the intermediaries, and I think this is the one that we're most familiar with, right? So this is what happens is you create a platform for on-demand services, right? So you've got Uber as sort of the best example of this, but you've got Airbnb and so forth, and the emergence of these kinds of sharing activities. And this is the one here which I think companies can most easily monetize. Right? So you create a platform, you invest in a platform, the sunk cost, and you essentially make money on on-demand services. I would say that altruists, it's impossible to monetize because the underlying motive is not about making money. Ownership is paid per use. And I think if you're looking at collectivists, it's about sponsorship, it's about banner advertising, it's about fundraising, right? So I think when I first started looking at the sharing economy, my interest, I think I was predominantly focusing on the intermediaries. But actually, when you kind of look at it a bit further, you realize that there's this whole area of the sharing economy which is not monetized. And I'm going to make a hypothesis here. I think that increasingly in late capitalism, more and more of what we do will be non-monetized sharing. So let's look at some scenarios here. I'm going to give you 3 scenarios about what might be happening in the sharing economy. I've got this so-called conservative scenario where I'm essentially saying 25% of the typical economy will be shared. Then I've got a slightly more aggressive scenario where about half of the typical economy will be shared. And then I've got this radical scenario where most of the modern economy, or even the post-modern economy, you could even argue, will be mediated through shared transactions, where you get neo-bartering, where you get entire sectors of the economy that are not monetized, and that essentially exchange occurs on a bartering basis. Just before we get into the detail, think about energy sharing in local communities, smart grids. So I generate electricity. I have too much electricity than I need, so I just share it with my neighbour because my neighbour then maybe gives me something that I don't have, right? So what does the conservative scenario mean? What this means is that essentially service industries will become shared, right? So hospitality, transportation, peer lending, architectural services, our business education. If you think about Coursera, right, and the emergence of free online education, they're sometimes called massive online open courses, or MOOCs for short. I was recently talking to someone at BMW who's the sales director for the Middle East, and she was telling me that, you know, BMW are developing a 2025 strategy, and one of the scenarios they're talking about is BMW will go from being a company that makes cars for sale to being a company that makes cars for leasing only. Essentially, BMW will be they'll be a provider of transportation services rather than a producer of cars, which is, you know, a very far-reaching thing for a company like BMW. 3D printing will be used in mainly industries where customization is an important feature. So if you think about dentistry, people can get, you know, fillings or crowns done using 3D printers. I've actually seen it at work myself. I recently went to a dental studio and they actually showed me they had a 3D printer producing fake teeth to put in, so that's pretty amazing. Hospitals are using medical prosthetics using 3D printers. You know, given the horror of the war in Syria right now, it's very hard to get medical prosthetics into the country because the borders are closed. So what some of the hospitals that haven't been destroyed yet are using our 3D printers to print replacement limbs and so forth. I think it's also going to occur in high fashion. It already is. You can find websites where you can design your entire clothes from scratch and they'll print them for you. There's a company called Shareways, and you can send them your design and they'll print it for you. And of course, toys. So companies like Lego, for example, are beginning to embrace 3D printing technology. I think for companies that are using 3D printers right now, it's mainly a cost issue because it's actually cheaper. You don't need scale with 3D printers, but it creates other issues, which is outside the scope of our discussion today, but it is another issue that could be talked about. I think we're going to see the growth of artisanal markets. I've mentioned Etsy, but I think, you know, other things will emerge. I'm an advisor to a startup right now, which is called Vendeddy. You should go to their website, vendeddy.com, and sign up. We need everybody to sign up. They're an economy after all. And Vendeddy is the world's first online market for street artisans. Essentially what we're doing is we're bringing together people in developing countries who make street art when you go on vacation to the Caribbean or to Thailand, and instead of going to the market where you get ripped off 400%, you buy direct from the makers of the products themselves. So it's a potentially revolutionary company. It's just at the start, vendeddy.com. And, you know, as I say, disclosure, I'm involved with the company, so you need to know that. We've got renewable energy, which I mentioned before, and I think also software media content will be freemium. Freemium is this idea that we give you the core module for free, and then we get you to pay for extras. I'm addicted to Angry Birds, and I'm constantly paying for extra gems to get to the next level. I think I've probably paid 25,000 times more than I would have paid if I had to pay for the application. So well done to Angry Birds. Mid-range scenario. This is where I think, you know, more of the economy becomes shared. I think that's going to impact manufacturing, particularly B2B manufacturing. So essentially what we're going to get is companies replacing injection molding with additive manufacturing. I think telecoms companies will essentially disappear, and we're going to be using the Internet of Things for free, and our information will be shared for free. I think retailing will be significantly threatened. Here, online purchases will increase substantially. And I think clothing and toys will embrace 3D printing, not just in the factory, but also at home. And I think renewables become a core part of our energy mix. And then we have our radical scenario. Consumer financial and banking is replaced by a combination of non-monetized transactions and peer lending. 3D printers are in every home, like you have at home now. And prosumption is a mainstream activity. Prosumption, I haven't mentioned that before. Prosumption is production plus consumption simultaneously. right? So the traditional idea is that you produce one place and you consume in another. Here we're going to do them in the same place. And essentially we'll be getting most of our domestic energy from renewable sources. That will actually be the main part of our energy mix. So what does this mean for strategy? What does this mean for company strategies? This is a rather complex table, so I won't go into detail. Let's just think a little bit about monetization, which is one of the key aspects of competitive advantage, right? In the conservative scenario, I think what we're going to see is an emphasis on what we call two-sided markets. Two-sided markets where essentially you don't make money by providing the service, you make your money from taking the data. Right? So Facebook is free at the point of use, but actually the money's made by getting your data and selling that to somebody else. And I think that's already happening. By the way, I actually think the conservative scenario is the reality we face today. If we move to the mid-range scenario, I think the key thing here is control of ecosystem playgrounds. So essentially, successful companies will be companies that build platforms. If we go back to our table, in other words, intermediaries will be a key kind of industry in the future. And then if you look at the radical scenario, I think we basically say that the form of capitalism we know today is over. So that monetization is almost impossible to the point of disappearing entirely. So it's almost like back in time to bartering, where money disappears as a means of exchange. Let me focus here on the organizational form, because I'm conscious of the time and I want to leave time for questions. In the conservative scenario, and again, I think we see this already, companies will become increasingly what we call ambidextrous companies. And what does that mean? That means that essentially companies these days aren't just scaling or just innovating. They have to do both simultaneously, right? In order to scale their business, they have to have a pipeline of new ideas. And increasingly, that innovation won't be closed innovation. It'll be open source innovation. So companies will increasingly turn to their customers, not to give them a product and give market research. It'll be like, we don't know what you want. You tell us what you want. So we've been bringing people into the company, and they'll be doing more and more of that, I think, in the future. I think a nice example of this is TripAdvisor. TripAdvisor is where users of hospitality services provide information for free. Journalism is amazing, isn't it? Think about journalism 20 years ago. You read an article in the Magyar Hírlap, if that existed 20 years ago, assuming it did, and you don't like the article. So then you write a letter to the editor. And if you're lucky, a week later, your edited letter appears in the column Letters from Readers. And now think about journalism today, right? If you think about journalism today, you go to YouTube and you get live streaming of real-time events, not taken by journalists, but taken by citizen journalists, right? So if you think about it, if you're a media company, this is a massive threat, right? Because not only do you not have a monopoly of the production of news, you have so much competition now about where the news comes from. I mean, I've stopped watching network news. I don't bother. I spend my entire time in front of my laptop watching news from YouTube. And I think that's very much part of what we're living through right now. If we move to the mid-range scenario, I think what we're going to see is what we call descaling. So companies will increasingly move away from centralizing production in low-cost locations, right? If you think about outsourcing and offshoring, it's largely because of cost considerations. And we're going to move back to a more local production that is globally networked. So we're going to be sharing digital production knowledge and printing that knowledge locally, right? And then in the radical scenario, capitalism is over as we know it, and we move toward what I call atomized peer-to-peer collaboration. So individuals are their own production. So we go back to the village, where someone in the village did hand-knitted clothing. There was someone else who made shoes, and then there was the guy who put the horseshoes on your horse. The blacksmith, that's the word in English. Right? But it won't be the traditional industries, it'll be everything. Yeah? So here's some closing thoughts. I mean, I think that basically The sharing economy is going to rewrite the strategy book, which I teach several times a year. And it's going to force me to rethink what we mean by business strategy, which I think is a really sort of fundamental change. And I didn't mention this, and maybe it's good because now this will have more impact. I mean, I think essentially what we're moving from is an economic system, which is an economic system based around scarcity, right? Supply and demand, to an economy of abundance. So that actually, if energy is free to produce because it comes from the sun, if transportation services are shared for free, if knowledge is shared for free, if news is generated for free, then it's not a matter of paying for anything, right? There's an economy of abundance. And I think for those of us who are interested in strategy as a concept, for those of you who took strategy class with me, you remember I talked a lot about sustainable competitive advantage, its ability to financially outperform your rivals on a 3 to 5 year basis. Essentially, it's game over. And that companies won't be able to achieve competitive advantage in the traditional sense. They're going to have to find a way to make money in a completely different way. My current bet on this is that I think successful companies will either be platform companies who control these very large ecosystems, or companies that are able to have a series of short-term wins, and that all adds up to sustainable financial performance. Those are my thoughts. I hope you found some of my thoughts interesting. Why don't we turn it over for questions?
So maybe if I may ask those questions,
sure. Go ahead.
Which have already been sent to us. The first question is that to what extent do you see the sharing economy giving rise to a parallel economy of companies whose organizational purpose is social contribution as opposed to profit?
That's a great question, right? And again, if we go back to that 2x2 diagram that I used earlier, sorry, here we go. You can see that, I'll change the colour of my pen because there's too much red there. I'll put some blue. You can see that entire sectors of the economy are not about making money, right? They're about providing social goods, public goods, which are not necessarily driven by profit motives. So I agree completely that is a significant possibility.
Okay, next question. What are the criteria for deciding if goods services are possible objects of sharing or not? Storage space, cloud, time-sharing vacation resorts, and books, library are good examples for sharing, but nobody will share a pet, self-made furniture, or a gift got from a sweetheart. How about minerals, flora, fauna, clean, not polluted air and water? Can these goods be regarded as shared?
Wow, that's a big question. Let me try and, like eating an elephant, let me take it in chunks. I think if I rephrase the question here is, are there some sectors of the economy which will not be subject to sharing, right? And I think that's also an excellent question.
Well, we're encouraging.
So I think like restaurants are probably going to be reasonably exempt from sharing. Sharing a pet, I can't see why that wouldn't be shared, particularly if it's a digital pet. Just thinking ahead.
But during vacation, it can be shared.
Right? Now, if the gift that I get from my sweetheart is a car, that could be shared. But you're right, where there's sentimental value, then clearly that's not necessarily going to be something that people will willingly share. Let me just take a sidestep to try and sort of get more deeply into this question. I think sort of the period that's led up to where we are today was a period a period in which capitalism per se won over socialism or communism as we call it. I think it was more a matter of consumerism winning over non-consumerism. And again, I'm going to stick my neck out here. I think we're moving to a post-consumerist age. I think people are becoming increasingly aware of the non-renewable resources that you've mentioned, minerals, flora, fauna, clean air. And I think people are recognizing that we overconsume. And that actually we do two things. We overconsume some things and therefore use up them when we can't get them back. And we underutilize things that we currently have. And I think that those processes are going to drive it. So yes, there will be sectors that remain outside of the sharing economy, but I think over time, fewer and fewer of those sectors will remain away from the sharing economy. I don't know whether I answered the question, but I think that was my best effort.
Okay, next question. What is the significance of open source? Do you think that the sharing economy was started in part because of the popularity of open source, or is open source simply a symptom and part of the sharing economy?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So I think a sort of an implicit thing I've been saying throughout this discussion is that technology is the fundamental driver of this, right? Digitization in particular. And so I think you're right. I think open source, I mentioned Linux, right? That was one of the first examples of sharing. Right? So it was like a leading indicator of sharing, because I think, I'm not an anthropologist or an ethnographer, because I think the people that were doing Linux were kind of psychologically and culturally people that like to share. Right? So you see sharing emerge in sectors where sharing is part of the cultural values of the community. And so I tend to agree with you that I think that it is a leading indicator. But I think what's happening with the experience of Linux is that that idea of sharing is becoming a more mainstream cultural value among millennials. And so I think actually it's both a cause and is caused by sharing. So I think we're going to see more Linux in more places around the world than we saw 10 to 15 years ago.
Okay, we received another question. What about basic human attitude to own things first, then maybe share?
Well, yeah, so that's the assumption of the millennials that I've made, right? The assumption I'm making is that millennials are less interested in ownership and more interested in access. And that's my assumption. And I think it's kind of borne out by early studies of millennial behaviours. So, we're going to have to agree to disagree on that, because that's just a fundamental assumption I have.
Okay, another question from Vlad. Andy Ruin, less Android, less open source in 2003.
I did not get the question. Sorry, could you repeat it again? Yeah.
Yeah. So that was not a question.
It was a statement.
Yeah.
What was the statement?
Andy Ruin, less Android, less open source in 2003.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't understand that. I'm going to have to bow to someone's superior knowledge of the issue. My apologies.
Yeah.
Those are the questions? Very good.
Another question. What about labor laws? I'm thinking about cases such as the one Uber and the likes face, where outsourced contractors should be treated as own employees, but such platforms deny that they should be. What do you see? Where do you see the solution emerging in labor laws?
Yeah, really great question. And it's not just labor law; it's also taxation, right? So I've kind of ignored the state in my entire presentation, but now I've had 2 or 3 presentations like this, and this question keeps coming back, which is, does the sharing economy exploit people? Right? So is the sharing economy just another form of capitalism where essentially owners of capital exploit labor? And the piece I wrote for HVG recently, I kind of presented that argument that essentially, there are elements of this within the Uber ecosystem. And I read a piece this week on the BBC website about how Airbnb was unilaterally closing off access to the platform to apartment owners who rely upon renting out space in their apartments for income. Right? So I agree. I think the sharing economy is going to have profound impacts on labour law, and I think society needs to be very conscious that we don't allow the sharing economy to become another opportunity for individuals to be exploited. And I think social protections, we're going to have to rethink social protections, let's put it that way. Let me come to the issue of taxation. I think that's also an important issue. I mean, if you look right now, one of the current disputes that's taking place both in the UK and here in Hungary is this issue of how do we tax Uber? Because for a long time, Uber drivers were not being taxed at all. And so the government, I think, is also looking at the emergence of sharing and saying, we have a problem here because we can't easily tax this activity. So I think in the area of fiscal law, we're going to have some new ways of thinking about how this kind of economic activity is taxed. A great question.
Okay, the next question is a sharing economy a final destination, or rather just a way to a new state of traditional economy?
Yeah, so I think I touched upon that toward the end of our discussion. So I'm not a believer that history repeats itself. I'm not one of these people that says that. I mean, I think historical events can reoccur in different forms, but generally speaking, I don't believe in this circularity of history. Do I think that less and less of what we consume will be produced by large integrated companies? Yes. And do I think that more and more of what we consume and share will be done locally? I think the answer is yes. Again, if I come back to Jeremy Rifkin, he's a great guy, great books. You should definitely read them. If you don't read the books, you can watch his videos. They're 1 hour long rather than a book which is 500 pages long. So you can do it quickly. If you think about the Middle Ages, right, where the artisan economy predominated, it was a pretty brutish life, right? I mean, you didn't have your own bedroom. You shared a room with 5 other people. There was no privacy, right? You lived short life. Most of you died from some kind of horrible disease. So I don't think we're going back to a world that looks like that. But I do think that the age of privacy is over. I don't think in the sharing economy you can have privacy. I think it's done. So you may not be sharing a bedroom with somebody, or your brother and sister, but you're definitely going to have your round of applause. But I definitely think you're going to have much of what you do economically in the public sphere in a way that hasn't happened before.
Okay, we have received a question from Vlad. He said that apologies for the early confusion.
Yes.
This less. Question, where do you see Tesla Motors going with the energy storage Tesla Powerwall? Considering that they are using the actual car they are producing as a vector to propel the energy industry in a different realm?
Yeah, great question. Let me throw another potential car maker into the mix, which is Google, who are trying to make driverless cars, right? So if you look at Tesla and Google, I think they're essentially transforming the car business. And from the perspective of the traditional car makers, they're essentially undermining the entire concept of assembling cars. On the one hand, you've got Tesla, right, which is I don't know if anyone's been in a Tesla. I've been in one recently. They're incredible cars. Quiet, you can't hear the engine. They perform as well as a traditional combustion engine. The issue is storage, energy storage, but I think I think Elon Musk is working on that. And I agree. I mean, I think he's trying to link renewable energy to transportation services. That's one movement, I think. And then the other movement is the driverless car. And last week, Google got clearance from the federal government to allow Google cars to be driven on public roads in the United States. So I think these are parallel developments which are transforming the industry. And not just the car industry, if I may add, the oil and gas industry. This is, again, we can't talk about this today, we don't have time, but this is another fundamental shift in the geopolitical configuration of the planet. If we stop using petrol, then the Middle East as a geopolitical question becomes irrelevant. And that changes so many things, for good and for bad, let me add.
Another question from Taka. Do you think that sharing economy contributes to microeconomic growth? Is sharing economy a form of redistribution of wealth?
Yes to both. This concept of GDP is irrelevant in the sharing economy because we don't monetize. So GDP is a monetized measurement of economic activity. So GDP doesn't include bringing up children, which in my opinion is kind of valuable, but we don't measure it. GDP, of course, doesn't measure the illegal economy by definition because you don't want people to know about it. GDP often measures things that is actually harmful to society. So, for example, after that terrible oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, US GDP went up because of the cleaning effort, the money invested to clean it up. Now, so I agree. I mean, I think that what the sharing economy does is it basically makes the concept of GDP growth irrelevant. We will no longer focus on GDP growth as a fundamental measure of economic prosperity. Bhutan, which is a very small kingdom in the Himalayas, has recently switched from GDP to gross national happiness, right, which is a completely different measure of economic welfare. Second half of your question, will it reduce income inequality? That's a more difficult question to answer. What I would say is that if more and more of what we consume is not monetized, we won't need income, and therefore we won't focus so heavily on income inequality itself. Whereas, as we know, in the current phase of capitalism, income inequality is at its highest it's ever been. Historically, at the Davos summit a couple of weeks ago, Oxfam produced the annual Global Wealth Report, where they showed that 50% of the world's wealth was owned by 63 people. You know, which is unbelievable. One of whom is the founder of our university, by the way. So we shouldn't complain, I guess. But I mean, those levels of inequality are astonishing, and I think that's also. I didn't really get into that in my presentation today, but I think that's one of the other driving forces of the sharing economy. People just don't have the money anymore. They can't buy things. They don't have regular jobs, so they have to share as a way of survival.
So far, no further questions.
Okay, so why don't we wrap it up in that case? Thanks to all of you who were online today. This is my very first ever webinar, so I'm not sure whether I did a very good job. I believe it's going to be made available for watching later on. That's very nice. Was that a fake round of applause? Canned applause. But please get in touch. If you've got any questions, my email address is on the website. And it's nice to have so many of you online, and thank you very much.